What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, the man who stole my husband asked me to save his life, and I laughed, because after everything he had taken from me, the idea that I would be the one to step in and rescue him was so absurd it almost felt like a prank. The call came in the middle of a workday, and when I glanced at the caller ID, it was the community hospital, the same one where I had once spent long hours volunteering during nursing school before life sent me in another direction. For a split second, I thought it might be some billing error or maybe a wrong number, but when the voice on the other end calmly asked if I was Maya Collins and then explained that my brother Ethan had been admitted after an accident on a job site, my stomach tightened. What caught me wasn't the news of his injury. I had built enough distance from him over the years to stop flinching at his name, but the assumption that followed. They wanted to confirm I was still listed as his emergency contact. And guarantor. That word, guarantor, hit like a punch. Because anyone who has dealt with American hospitals knows it doesn't mean someone who cares. It means someone who pays if nobody else does. I told the nurse, very politely, that there must be some mistake, because Ethan had a wife, Lily, who could handle his paperwork, and I was not in any way responsible for his care. The nurse hesitated, as if reading a screen in front of her, then said my name was still on the file from years ago when Ethan had used me as a backup contact for his contracting business. Back before he betrayed me and back before I learned that nothing he put my name on could ever end well. When I hung up, the phone started lighting up almost immediately. My parents first. My mother's voice, heavy with that old mix of guilt and manipulation, went on about how family doesn't turn its back in times of crisis, how blood is thicker than water, how Ethan had made mistakes, but he was still my brother. Then my father cut in, telling me flat out that I had a moral duty to help with the upfront cost of surgery, because the hospital wouldn't proceed without a deposit. I asked where Lily was in all of this, and the silence on the other end was telling. Apparently, she had been the one to give the hospital my number in the first place, claiming I was the most reliable. Imagine that, the woman who wrecked my marriage by sneaking around with my brother deciding that I was the safe bet to sign the paperwork that could ruin me financially. I didn't scream. I didn't rant. I just listened. And then I called admissions back, calmly explained that under no circumstance should my name appear on any record associated with Ethan's care, and formally requested removal as contact and guarantor. I even went as far as pulling up my credit monitoring account and locking my credit down again, just in case someone got clever with forged applications. Because if you've ever been burned by someone who treats other people's resources like their personal piggy bank, you learn that the smallest oversight can cost you everything. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, phone buzzing with texts from Lily, please, just until the insurance kicks in, you know we'll pay you back. This is life or death, and I realized something important. Years ago, when they blindsided me with their affair, I thought the worst pain I would ever feel was the betrayal itself. But no, the worst pain had been the months afterward, when I let them and my parents paint me as bitter, cold, unforgiving, when in reality I had been the one left picking up pieces no one else cared about. This time, though, I was not picking up anything. This time, I was not stepping in as the fixer. And just when I thought the storm might quiet down, I got an email from the admissions department. They had reviewed Ethan's accident paperwork and, based on the details, there was a possibility of liability attached to the company vehicle he had been driving. The problem was that according to the DMV records, the truck was still co-owned by him and me. My name, on a title I thought I had signed away years ago, sitting in their system like a trap waiting to snap shut. If that proved accurate, the hospital could argue that my financial responsibility wasn't a choice, it was baked into the wreck itself. I stared at that email for a long time, letting the irony sink in. After everything, after the affair, after the divorce, after the years of rebuilding my life, there it was again, Ethan's mess, pulling at me like quicksand, threatening to drag me back into a battle I never asked for. Only this time, I wasn't 25 and naive. I wasn't crying in the dark while they lived their shiny new life. I had learned how to fight quietly, with paperwork, with proof, with boundaries that couldn't be twisted. So when the next call came in, not from the hospital but from my father again, asking if I could just sign something temporarily to get the ball rolling. I laughed, really laughed. The kind of laugh that comes not from humor, but from the absurdity of watching people think you'll play the same role forever. I told him, as clearly as I could, that I would not sign anything, I would not guarantee anything, and I would not lift a finger to make Ethan's surgery possible. If he wanted help, he had a wife, a business, and a life he chose over me. Let them figure it out. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because that one line in the hospital's email, the one about the truck title, meant there was still a hook buried in my name, and Ethan would not let go without dragging me through another round of chaos. And the truth was, I had already decided. This time, the chaos would not end with me on the losing side. This time, I was going to flip the script. When the fundraiser page first popped up, sent to me by 3 different friends before I even finished my morning coffee, I knew exactly whose fingerprints were all over it because the wording had that same syrupy, self-sacrificial tone Lily always used when she wanted strangers to believe she was living some noble tragedy rather than the mess she and Ethan had built for themselves. The headlines screamed about urgent surgery, about how insurance was cruelly refusing to cover life-saving care, about how a young father's future hung in the balance unless the community could rally behind him, and at the very bottom there it was. The hook that made my jaw tighten, his sister is his only hope, but she has turned her back, leaving us desperate. Reading that line, I felt a mix of fury and almost amusement because it was so predictable, so lazily manipulative, and yet I knew there would be people ready to open their wallets, not because they understood the truth, but because guilt sells. Better than honesty. For years, I had stayed quiet while people whispered that I had overreacted, that I should have forgiven Ethan and Lily because love happens and family is family. I let them live in the glow of their curated story while I rebuilt myself silently, thinking that maybe dignity was keeping my side clean. But staring at that fundraiser, I realized that silence doesn't always equal dignity. Sometimes it just lets liars write the official version. So I decided, in that exact moment, that I was going to correct the record without writing a single angry word, without ranting or cursing or begging people to see me as the victim. I was going to let evidence do the talking. It took me less than 10 minutes to gather what I needed, because the thing about people like Lily is that they can't resist bragging online, even when they're supposedly drowning in hardship. The first screenshot was from her Instagram, posted just 3 weeks earlier, where she stood in front of a glossy new SUV with a caption about manifesting abundance and a string of hashtags about gratitude. The second screenshot came from Ethan's Facebook page, where he was grinning on a boat with a beer in hand, bragging about weekend freedom. The third was a photo she had uploaded during a luxury shopping trip, tags still dangling off a designer purse that cost more than some people's rent. Each image had a date stamp, each one recent, and none of them looked like the life of a couple crushed under medical bills and injustice. I uploaded the screenshots directly into the comment section of their fundraiser. No explanation, no caption, no name calling, just the images themselves alongside the timeline of my divorce finalization, the date Ethan married Lily, and the simple fact that I had legally removed myself as his emergency contact years ago. Then I closed my laptop and went about my day. By the time I checked back that evening, the page was in flames. Donations that had trickled in during the morning had stopped altogether. Comments poured in from people asking why they were begging for help while flaunting boats and designer bags, and even a former client of Ethan's chimed in, accusing him of stiffing them on an invoice from last year. Lily tried deleting comments, then turned off the comment function altogether, but the screenshots were already circulating on other platforms, shared and reshared with captions like, "Some nerve," and "This is why people don't trust fundraisers anymore." My phone lit up nonstop. My mother's voice shook with outrage, accusing me of humiliating the family, of kicking my brother when he was down, as if posting his own bragging photos was some cruel act of sabotage rather than a mirror held up to reality. My father went silent, which I knew was his version of seething, the silence that meant he thought I had gone too far but couldn't find the words to argue against facts. Lily texted me in rapid bursts, switching between pleading, "Please delete it," "You don't understand how bad this looks," and attacking, "You've always been jealous. You've always hated me. You'll regret this." And through it all, I stayed quiet because there was nothing else to say. I hadn't lied, I hadn't exaggerated, I hadn't twisted a single thing. I had simply pulled back the curtain and let people see the life they had been hiding behind their sob story. What struck me most was how quickly the tide turned. Friends who had once told me to be the bigger person suddenly messaged me things like, "I had no idea they were still like this," or "I see now why you walked away." Even people who had always defended Ethan started backing off, unwilling to be associated with a couple who claimed desperation while posting luxury purchases. And yet, for all the satisfaction I felt in watching their facade crumble, I also knew this was just the beginning, because exposing hypocrisy online might have stopped the money flow, but it didn't erase the one line still dangling like a noose. The hospital's reminder that my name was still tied to that truck involved in the accident. That night, just as I was pouring myself a glass of wine, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. It was Priya from the hospital's revenue department, her tone polite but firm, telling me we needed to discuss the ownership of the vehicle involved in the crash. She explained that liability might extend to me if my name was still on the title, and she wanted to confirm whether I intended to assume that responsibility or contest it. The words "assume responsibility" echoed in my head, heavy and deliberate, and I felt the weight of what could come next. For years, I had told myself I was free of Ethan's mess, that all my ties had been cut, but now it seemed that some piece of paperwork from a forgotten DMV file was still there, waiting to drag me back. I thanked her for calling, promised I would look into it, and hung up. Then I sat there in the quiet, the glow of the wine glass catching the light, and let myself feel both the victory of the day and the unease of what was coming. Because yes, I had won this round. I had silenced the lies without saying a word, had reminded them that truth always surfaces, but the hospital's question told me there was another round ahead, one where facts would matter even more, and where silence alone might not protect me. And for the first time in years, I felt something unexpected, not fear, not sadness, but a sharpened determination. If Ethan wanted to drag me back into his chaos, then I would meet him there, not with anger, but with precision, with proof, and with the kind of calm power that he and Lily would never see coming. The morning after Priya's careful warning about the truck title, I pulled the old fireproof folder from the back of my closet where I keep everything that once had the power to ruin me, and I spread the contents across my kitchen table like a surgeon laying out instruments, because if there is one thing I learned from surviving a marriage that collapsed into an affair with my own brother, it is that you do not wait for mercy when paperwork can give you leverage, and you do not plead with people who count on your silence when statutes and timestamps can do the talking for you. I found the bill of sale Ethan had drafted years ago when he swore he would retitle the company truck into his name alone, complete with his messy signature and my clean one. And right underneath it a copy of the title application we had filled together on a day I now remember as a fog of false promises and hollow gratitude, and when I compared the application number to the DMV confirmation in my emails, I realized that he had never finished the transfer, which meant that the state still saw me as tethered to his work vehicle and therefore potentially tethered to the consequences of his accident. A reality that clicked into place with an almost physical snap in my chest. I made 3 calls before lunch, each one as calm as a metronome, because if panic writes checks, calm amends records. First I called the DMV, and after the usual maze I reached a supervisor who confirmed that the title remained active in joint ownership and who, to my surprise, sounded almost grateful that someone wanted to fix the mess. And she walked me through filing a corrective affidavit that would timestamp my intent to remove myself from liability effective immediately, which I then notarized at my bank and returned by secure upload with a scanned copy of the old bill of sale attached. Second, I called Ethan's auto insurance carrier, provided the claim number from Priya's email, and notified them in writing that I was disputing any liability on the grounds of an incomplete transfer that was contrary to the underlying sale and contrary to my actual use of the vehicle, which had been 0 for years. And I asked that all communications copy me in writing only, because people who twist your words cannot twist a certified letter. Third, I called Priya back, thanked her for flagging the risk before it hit, and laid out the structure she would need to route the bill away from me and toward the correct pockets. auto medical payments first under the policy for injuries tied to the crash, then the at-fault party's bodily injury, or, if Ethan was the at-fault party on a client's property, the client's liability rider, then and only then major medical within his own plan for anything left over, with hospital financial assistance. As the last step if those layers left a gap, none of which, I emphasized kindly but firmly, included the ex-sister who once signed a title under a promise that was never kept. Because I do not work in clinical care, but I do work in healthcare operations, I understand that revenue cycle teams are not villains and they are not saviors. They are people in a complex system trying to match documents to dollars. And when you give them clarity instead of drama, they will often meet you with the same, which is exactly what happened when Priya paused on the line and said that if I could share any benefits information or contacts, she would make sure her team focused their energy in the right direction. So I looped in my friend Jenna, who runs benefits for a mid-size employer and who has the kind of mind that turns chaos into flowcharts. And within an hour, she had sketched the clean claim order and even drafted the language for a proof of non-responsibility letter that stated, in the kind of precise English that insurance adjusters respect, that my name was present on a legacy title through administrative delay, not through ownership or use, and that corrective filings were now in motion, after which I sent the letter to the carrier, to Priya, and, for good measure, to my own email with red receipts in case this ever needed to sit in front of a judge who could appreciate timestamps more than tears. By late afternoon, the fundraiser that had stalled the day before went quiet and Lily's messages shifted from outrage to panic, asking if I had talked to the hospital yet because they were getting stonewalled by billing. And I let the text sit unread while I opened a new browser tab and checked county records, because the most honest conversations happen in public databases that do not care about family narratives. 2 quick searches showed a recent deed settlement on a tidy little house in their names and a registration on a modest boat that matched the photo Ethan had posted with a beer balanced on the railing, and I took screenshots of both because, as Priya had hinted, hospitals do not chase people. They chase assets, and if assets exist, the conversation stops being a plea for charity and becomes a question of priority. My parents called in the evening and I answered, not because I expected kindness, but because I wanted a record in my own head of where the line stood. And when my mother tried the old script about family unity and my father tried the newer script about just signing something to keep it moving, I told them in one long breath that I had filed the DMV correction, notified the carrier, established the coverage order, and ensured that the hospital would be speaking to the legal spouse and the relevant insurers, and that I would not be facilitating, funding, or fronting anything, not now and not later, because history had already taught me what happened when I acted like a safety net. And I was done being woven into a trapeze act I never wanted to watch again. There was a pause that stretched so long I could hear the sound of my father's jaw tightening, and then he muttered that I had always been cold, to which I replied that I had finally become warm to myself, and I ended the call. Without anger, because dignity, once you own it, does not need an audience. An hour after dark, my phone buzzed with a new email from Priya, short and careful, confirming receipt of the affidavit and the benefits outline, and then a second line that made me sit up straighter at the table where my documents still lay in neat rows. Based on preliminary checks, the hospital believed a lien would be appropriate against certain titled property to secure payment for surgical services if insurer coordination left a gap, and she asked whether I wished to be copied on the formal notice as a courtesy given my prior contact on the account, which I answered with a simple yes, because watching a bill walk itself to the right door is a kind of quiet music you only appreciate after years of being the wrong address. And as I shut down the laptop and turned off the kitchen light, I felt the air change, not because the storm had passed, but because the barometer had dropped and the weather was about to break, and I knew, in that steady part of me that no longer flinched at Ethan's name, that the next sound I would hear would not be a plea for help, but the crack of consequences landing exactly where they should. When the hospital's formal notice of lien arrived at Ethan and Lily's doorstep, hand-delivered by a process server who treated it with the same casual neutrality as any other piece of paperwork, the story they had built so carefully over the years The picture of themselves as the golden couple who had somehow made betrayal look glamorous began to crack, and for the first time in a very long time, the cracks were visible to everyone, not just to me. The fundraiser had already dried up after my silent intervention with those screenshots, but this document carried the kind of weight that Instagram filters and tearful captions could not erase. Because it was not about feelings or narratives or carefully chosen words, it was about numbers stamped in black ink and assets placed on the chopping block, and once the lien existed, the hospital had every legal right to secure payment directly from the house they had just bragged about and the boat. That had been their weekend toy. The fallout spread quickly, not because I told anyone about it, but because gossip has a way of moving faster when the subjects have built their entire lives on projecting a perfect image. Subcontractors who had been waiting on checks from Ethan suddenly started calling each other, comparing notes, and realizing that none of them were getting paid on time, which turned into whispered conversations about whether the accident had left him insolvent or whether he had always been juggling debts behind the scenes. A supplier put his account on hold, which meant his next project ground to a halt before it even began. And a client quietly began consulting their own attorney about whether his violation of safety rules on their site left them vulnerable to liability they had not anticipated. By the end of the week, Ethan's business, which he had once waved in my face as proof that he had won after stealing my husband and building a shiny new life, looked more like a crumbling set held up by duct tape, and Lily's silence on social media confirmed what the whispers already knew. The perfect couple had finally collided with the math they had avoided for years. It was strange to watch all of this unfold without lifting a finger, without needing to write a word, because for so long I had believed that getting justice meant fighting louder than the people who lied about me. That survival required me to plead my case over and over to an audience that was already predisposed to doubt me. Yet here I was, simply watching from the sidelines, while the very systems Ethan had ignored, the DMV filings, the insurance protocols, the hospital billing hierarchy, delivered consequences far harsher than anything I could have orchestrated on my own. And the best part was that all of it was clean, quiet, and perfectly legal. Of course, my parents did not see it that way. My mother called with that familiar edge in her voice, accusing me of being vindictive, of feeding the fire, even though I had not set a single spark beyond defending my own name. My father accused me of trying to destroy the family, and when I reminded him that Ethan and Lily had destroyed it the day they chose to betray me, he snapped that I was twisting the past. I let them talk, because I had reached a point where their words could no longer penetrate the wall I had built, and when they paused to wait for me to fold, I simply told them that I was not involved in their mess, that the documents were moving through the proper channels, and that if they wanted to help their son, they could mortgage their own home instead of asking me to co-sign the fallout of choices I had never made. The most telling moment came not from my parents, though, but from Ethan himself, when he finally called me directly from his hospital bed. His voice was weak, probably from the surgery, but his tone was the same as it had always been when he wanted something from me, sharp, demanding, and filled with the assumption that I would eventually cave. He did not apologize, did not acknowledge the past, did not even attempt humility. Instead, he told me that if I did not step in to help cover the rehab program he needed, I would regret it, that I was making enemies where I should be making peace, and that family has long memories. In the background, I could hear Lily, her voice breaking, whispering please over and over as though repeating the word might crack through the armor I had grown. And I will be honest, for a fraction of a second, the old reflex tugged at me, the instinct to step in, to smooth things over, to be the responsible one who kept the family from falling apart. But then I remembered standing in the hallway years ago, holding divorce papers while they smiled at each other like conspirators who had outplayed me, and I remembered the months of being treated like the bitter leftover, the one too cold to forgive. And the tug dissolved into something steadier than anger. It became clarity. So I told Ethan, in one long unbroken stream of words, that I had corrected the records, secured my freedom, and ensured that the hospital and the insurers were speaking to the only people who owed them answers, him and his wife. I told him that if he wanted to look for villains, he should try the mirror, because I had not stolen anyone's marriage. I had not forged anyone's signature, and I had not spent years pretending that living beyond my means was the same as living a good life. I told him that his threats meant nothing to me anymore, because a threat only works when the person on the other side still cares enough to be afraid. Then I hung up, and for the first time in years, I felt the final cord of obligation snap clean. Later that night, as I sat in my quiet apartment, I realized that revenge had not been some grand act of cruelty or some dramatic showdown. It had been the steady refusal to play my old role, the role of fixer, guarantor, and silent witness to their lies. It had been the calm decision to let their own actions and their own arrogance write the ending of their story. And as much as Ethan might have wanted me to feel guilt or fear, all I felt was a strange kind of satisfaction, because the truth had finally landed where it belonged, and for once, I was not the one left holding the wreckage. But even in that satisfaction, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were not done trying, because people who have lived their lives feeding on others rarely stop until every possible angle has been exhausted. And if Ethan's weak, angry voice was any clue, there would be one more round, one more desperate attempt to pull me back into the chaos. I did not know what form it would take, but I knew this much. I was ready, and this time, I was already holding the final move. When the dust began to settle and the hospital confirmed that Ethan's surgery had been covered through the layers of insurance I had so carefully pointed them toward, with the lien on his house and boat securing whatever remained, I felt a kind of closure that was less about celebration and more about relief. The relief of knowing that for once I had not been cornered into paying the bill for someone else's reckless choices. The hospital had done what hospitals do best when they have the right documents. They aimed their efforts at the assets that could pay, and they ignored the distractions of guilt, family pleading, and emotional manipulation. Watching that process unfold without my intervention, without my money, and without my name left exposed, was like finally seeing a door close that had been left open for too many years. A door through which Ethan and Lily had always assumed they could drag me whenever their own messes grew too heavy to carry. Of course, even after all of that, the cycle of manipulation did not end quietly, because people like Ethan and Lily rarely surrender when there is still one more person left to pressure. Just days after he was discharged, still recovering but already scheming, Ethan called me with Lily on speaker, and together they tried a final desperate tactic. They told me that the rehab facility required a cosign for certain extended services, that the insurance would only cover a portion, and that without my help he would never fully recover. The pitch was familiar, a remix of all the old family scripts. Family is supposed to step in, siblings should look out for each other, and I was in the best position to help because I had always been the responsible one. But this time, instead of feeling the tug of guilt or the sting of accusation, I laughed, not cruelly, but in a way that came from deep recognition that the playbook had not changed at all, even after everything, and that my role in it had finally, permanently ended. I told them, in a steady voice that did not waver, that I would not cosign a single form, would not attach my name to a single document, and would not hand over even 1 cent to cover his mistakes. I reminded them that they had chosen their life together, that they had taken from me without apology, that they had rewritten the story to make themselves heroes while painting me as the villain, and that now the consequences were theirs to bear. And then, because I wanted the boundary to be unshakable, I drafted a 1-page letter that same night, printed it, signed it, and delivered it by certified mail, a letter that stated in clear legal language that I was not to be listed as contact, guarantor, or financial backup for Ethan or Lily in any capacity, and that any violation of that boundary would result in immediate legal action. It was not a threat written in anger, but a statement of fact, and I copied the hospital and the insurers on the letter as well, ensuring that every system involved understood the line I had drawn. My parents reacted exactly as I expected, calling me heartless, insisting that no matter what Ethan had done, no matter how Lily had hurt me, family obligations should outweigh personal grievances. They begged me to be the one who restored peace, but I simply answered with a single sentence, "I am peaceful." And it was true. because for the first time in years, I no longer felt dragged into the chaos of their lives, no longer felt like I had to fight for air while they thrived on my silence. I had turned the tables not with screaming or revenge plotted in shadows, but with clarity, paperwork, and the refusal to keep playing a role that was never mine to begin with. The final piece fell into place when Priya from the hospital confirmed by email that not only had the surgery been paid, but that any surplus from insurance adjustments would be redirected to cover Ethan's outstanding subcontractor debts, a move that ensured the very people he had used and neglected would finally see repayment. I had not even requested it directly, but because I had stayed involved just enough to provide the right information, the system worked in a way that not only protected me but also redistributed the burden back onto him and his own resources. It was poetic in its practicality. Ethan had lived years flaunting a lifestyle built on other people's patience, and now, whether he liked it or not, those same people were being made whole through the collapse of his illusions. When I look back on it now, I see that revenge was never about destroying them or watching them suffer, because suffering is cheap and fleeting, and it does not erase betrayal. Revenge, for me, was finally living free of their grip, finally choosing myself over the endless obligation to fix what they had broken, and finally understanding that silence is powerful only when it is paired with action that cannot be twisted. I did not need to scream at family dinners, I did not need to prove my worth to anyone, and I did not need to explain why I was done. I only needed to stand firm, to refuse to sign, to refuse to pay, and to let their own actions chase them into the corners they had once reserved for me. And so when people ask if I feel guilty, if I wonder whether I went too far by laughing at my brother's plea for help, I tell them that guilt is a tool people use when they have nothing else left, and that in this case, it bounced off me like rain on a roof. I won not by destroying them, but by refusing to let them destroy me again. The brilliance was in the simplicity. I laughed, then signed nothing, and in that moment I finally took back everything they thought they had stolen forever.